When most of us picture Mexico, we picture two places. The first is a coastline. White sand, a swim-up bar, a wristband that means everything is paid for. A strip of resorts where the country arrives pre-translated, softened, served on a tray beside the pool. The second is a headline, a border, a warning, a name attached to a number. A place the news visits only when something has gone wrong. Both of these places are real. Neither of them is a lie. People do lie on those beaches, and people do live with that danger. But here is the strange thing about both pictures. Stand them side by side, and they still cover only a thin ribbon of the map. A few hundred kilometers of shoreline, a handful of cities along a line. Behind them sits a country the size of Western Europe, and almost none of it looks like either postcard. This is a nation that holds somewhere between a tenth and an eighth of every species known to science, on less than 2% of the planet's land. A nation where 68 languages are still spoken every day, some of them older than Latin. A nation whose capital, one of the largest cities on Earth, is built on the drowned bones of a city that was already larger than any in Europe when Europe first laid eyes on it. Beyond the beach and the headline lies the other Mexico, the one the brochure has no language for and the news has no reason to show. So the question is not whether Mexico is dangerous or beautiful or poor or rich. It is all of those things in different places on the same afternoon. The question is simpler and stranger. How does a country contain this much, this many worlds stacked inside one border? And how has so much of it survived? Start with something small. Every autumn, along the same invisible corridor that the headlines obsess over, something else crosses from north to south. Not people, not cargo, something that weighs less than a paperclip and travels 3,000 miles to a place it has never been. For 40 years, no one could say where it went. We will come back to it. Hold the thought. But to understand any of this, you have to understand how old it is. And the strange thing about the past in Mexico is that even the people we think of as ancient were themselves walking through ruins. An hour's drive north of the modern capital, two mountains rise out of the plain that are not mountains. They are pyramids. The larger one, the Pyramid of the Sun, stands 70 meters high and is one of the largest structures of the ancient world. Around them spreads a planned city, broad avenues, apartment compounds, workshops that once held perhaps 100,000 people, making it 1,500 years ago one of the biggest cities on the planet. Its name is Teotihuacan. And here is what unsettles even the experts. We do not know who built it. We do not know what language they spoke or what they called themselves or why, around the 7th century, the city burned and was abandoned. By the time the Aztecs found it, centuries later, it was already a ruin so old its builders were forgotten. The Aztecs did not build Teotihuacan. They discovered it, wandered into its silent avenues, decided that a place this vast could only be the work of gods, and gave it the name we still use. Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were born. They believed the sun itself had been set in motion there. They came to worship in a city whose makers they could not name, which tells you something about the depth of time this country is standing on. So when the Aztecs themselves built their capital, they were not beginning Mexico's story. They were already late to it. 700 years ago, in a high valley ringed by volcanoes, there was water. A shallow lake, 5 lakes really, joined at the seams, sitting in a basin 2,000 meters above the sea. And on an island in that lake, a people who called themselves the Mexica built a city. They had arrived as nobodies, a wandering tribe, late to the valley, given the worst land because no one else wanted it. A swamp, an island of mud and reeds. According to their own story, they settled there because they saw a sign their gods had promised them. An eagle on a cactus holding a snake. You have seen that eagle? It is on the flag of Mexico today. What they built on that mud should not have been possible. They could not grow crops on a lake, so they made land. Rafts of woven reeds packed with mud from the lake bed, anchored with willow roots until the roots reached the bottom and held. Floating gardens. They grew maize and beans and flowers on water. They cut canals so straight you could navigate the city by canoe. They piped fresh water in from the mainland on a double aqueduct, one channel always running while the other was cleaned. By the time European visitors arrived, the city they called Tenochtitlan held perhaps 200,000 people. London at the time held about 50,000. At the heart of it was a market. In the district of Tlatelolco, tens of thousands of people came every single day to trade. One Spanish soldier estimated 60,000. In an open plaza ordered as carefully as any bourse in Europe. Gold, jade, cacao beans used as money, cotton, feathers, herbs, obsidian blades, slaves, dyes, every kind of food. The same soldiers who saw it wrote that some among them had been to markets in Rome and Constantinople and had never seen anything so large, so orderly, so full. The emperor, Moctezuma, kept a zoo and a botanical garden and an aviary staffed by hundreds, collections of living things gathered from across his empire at a time when no king in Europe had thought to build such a thing. One of the men who walked into all of this was a Spanish soldier named Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who came with the conquistador Hernán Cortés in 1519. Decades later, as an old man, he tried to describe what he had seen. The causeways, the towers, the white temples rising out of the water. He wrote that some of his companions asked whether the things they were looking at were a dream. He could find no good way to say it. There was nothing in Europe to compare it to. And then, in the space of 2 years, it was gone. August 13th, 1521. After 93 days of siege, the city falls. Cortés has cut the aqueduct, so there is no fresh water. He has fewer than 1,000 Spanish soldiers, but he has tens of thousands of indigenous allies, peoples the Mexica had conquered and taxed and taken for sacrifice, who are only too willing to help end them. And he has something no one in the valley has ever encountered: smallpox. The disease arrives ahead of the army and moves through the island like fire through dry grass. By some accounts, it kills half the people in the city before the final assault even begins. The emperor who might have led the defense is already dead of it. What the siege does not destroy, the victors pull down on purpose. The temples are leveled. The canals are filled with the rubble of the city that built them. The largest city in the Americas is unmade, stone by stone, and on the flattened ground, the Spanish lay out a new capital. Mexico City, the center of an empire that will last 3 centuries. They drained the lake to build it. Slowly, Over generations, they pushed the water back, dried the basin, paved the mud. And here is the part no one tells you on the resort coast. The lake is still trying to come back. Mexico City today holds more than 20 million people. It is sinking, not slowly, not gently. In parts of the city, the ground drops as much as 50 centimeters in a single year because beneath the pavement is the soft clay of the old lake bed. And the city is pumping the water out from under itself to drink. Cathedrals tilt. Streets ripple like frozen waves. The metro has to be re-leveled. The Mexica built a city on water, and the Spanish built a city on the grave of it. And 500 years later, the ground still remembers that it was a lake. And in a few last canals on the southern edge of the city, the only place where the old floating gardens still exist, something else remembers too. A creature found nowhere else on Earth. We will come back to it. Because the conquest is not where Mexico's story ends. In some ways, it is where the country's strangest chapter begins. The Spanish did not come for cities, they came for metal. North of the capital, in a belt of dry hills the locals called the Bajío, the conquistadors found silver. Not a vein, but a country of it. The town of Guanajuato sat above one of the richest silver deposits ever discovered, a single seam, the Veta Madre, the mother lode, that ran for kilometers through the mountain. For 2.5 centuries, the mines of Mexico produced silver in quantities the world had never seen, and most of it left. They had a method for pulling the metal out of poor ore that changed the economics of the whole enterprise. They crushed the rock, spread it in a wide patio, and worked in mercury with their bare feet and the hooves of mules, turning it for weeks until the mercury bound to the silver and the silver could be lifted out of the waste. It let them mine ore that would otherwise have been worthless. It also poisoned the people and the rivers slowly for generations, in ways no one was counting. And the silver left. On ships, across 2 oceans, to pay for Spain's wars and Spain's palaces, and to buy silk and porcelain from China, where Mexican silver coins became so trusted they circulated as currency for centuries. The wealth that built cathedrals in Madrid came out of the ground in Guanajuato. It came out on the backs of indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans, working shafts that ran hundreds of meters down in heat and bad air, for wages that were often a fiction. What the silver left behind in Mexico was beauty paid for in suffering. Guanajuato is a city of narrow lanes and tiled domes, climbing the sides of a ravine, painted every color a person can mix. Some of the old silver towns the desert simply took back when the metal ran out. Places like Real de Catorce, half ghost, reached through a single dark tunnel cut into the rock, where pilgrims and the curious now walk streets that once held thousands. The mountains gave up a fortune, and the fortune sailed away, and the towns remained, quieter, stranger, still standing on the empty rooms beneath them. And the same desert those silver towns are dying in is, to another people, the holiest ground on earth. Every year, the Wixarica, the people outsiders call the Huichol, set out from their homes in the western mountains and walk. Hundreds of kilometers on foot, retracing a route their ancestors have followed for centuries, across the high desert toward a place they call Wirikuta, the very country that holds Real de Catorce. They are walking to where they believe the world was born, to gather peyote, the small, spineless cactus at the center of their religion, in a journey that is part prayer, part history lesson, part act of becoming someone new. The elders lead. The first-time pilgrims follow blindfolded at the sacred sites, because some things, they say, must be heard before they are allowed to be seen. It is one of the oldest, continuously practiced religious traditions on the continent, and it is still walked today, across land that, to a mining company, was only ever a map of metal, and to the Wixarica is the floor of heaven. That ground is not safe either. Concessions to dig for silver and gold have been granted over the very hills the pilgrims hold sacred, and the Wixarica have spent years in the courts and on the roads defending Wirikuta from the same hunger that built the ghost towns next door. The desert that once gave Spain its fortune is being asked to give again. And again, a people who were supposed to have been swept aside long ago are standing in the way of it, on foot, the way they always have. Not far west of the silver country, the land softens into the broad farms and blue-tinged fields of Jalisco, and out of this one state came two things the whole world now thinks of as simply Mexican. The first is a sound. Mariachi was born here. The trumpets and the violins, the big-bellied guitarron holding the bass, the singers in their silver-buttoned suits. It began as rural party music in the villages around Guadalajara and became, over a century, the voice the entire country sings its weddings and its funerals and its heartbreaks in. The second thing Jalisco gave the world grows in those blue fields: agave. Row on row of spiked silver-blue plants that look almost too geometric to be real, stretching to the horizon across a landscape so distinctive it is protected as a World Heritage Site. To make tequila from one of them takes patience that borders on the absurd. The blue agave grows for 7 or 8 years before it is ready. Then, the long leaves are stripped away by hand, with a flat blade called a coa, until only the heart remains, a pale, heavy core the size of a beach ball that the harvesters call the piña, the pineapple, because that is what it looks like. The hearts are roasted, crushed, and fermented. 8 years of growth for one bottle. The fields wait, and the people wait with them. But silver and song are still in their way, the Mexico the outside has heard of. To find the country the brochure cannot reach, you have to go south, into the part of the map where the conquest never finished its work. In the state of Oaxaca, the mountains fold the land into hundreds of separate valleys, each one its own small world. And in those valleys, the old languages did not die. 16 distinct indigenous peoples live in Oaxaca today. You can drive an hour and cross from one language into another as different from the first as English is from Russian. Zapotec, Mixtec, Mixe, each carrying its own poetry, its own way of counting, its own names for the dead. This soil holds something even older than the languages. In the dry valleys of Oaxaca and just to the north, archaeologists have traced the birth of the single most important plant in the history of the Americas. 9,000 years ago in these hills, people began to tame a scrawny wild grass called teosinte, a plant whose ears were barely the length of a finger, with a handful of rock-hard kernels, and over thousands of years of patient selection, seed by seed, generation by generation, they turned it into maize, corn. Everything that followed in this hemisphere, the cities, the empires, the floating gardens, the markets, was built on that one act of slow genius. And it did not stop with corn. The tomato, the chili, the bean, squash, vanilla, the cacao that becomes chocolate, the avocado. A vast share of the produce aisle in your supermarket was first grown by farmers in this part of the world and carried out to feed the rest of it. When people think of Mexico, they think of the food. They rarely realize the food is one of its oldest exports, that this country quietly handed the planet a third of what it eats. And the dead are not gone here, not the way they are gone elsewhere. There is a tradition most of the world thinks it knows, has seen on a movie poster, in a parade, in the painted skull face of a costume. Dia de Muertos, the Day of the Dead, and almost everyone gets it wrong. It is not Mexican Halloween. It is close to the opposite of Halloween. Halloween is the night you keep the dead out. This is the 2 days a year you invite them back in. The roots run 3,000 years deep to peoples who refused to treat death as an ending, who believed that to mourn the dead as lost was a kind of disrespect, because the dead was still family, still present, kept alive by memory. When the Spanish brought their own days for the dead, the two traditions did not replace each other. They braided together. And so, on the 1st and 2nd of November, families build an altar, an ofrenda, and lay out the things the dead loved. Bread, marigolds, whose scent is supposed to guide the soul home. A photograph, a glass of mezcal for the grandfather who liked it. The children's spirits are said to return on the first night, the adults on the second. It is not frightening. It is the warmest night of the year. One boy was born into this country of valleys and languages in 1806, in a village of fewer than 500 people, high in the Oaxacan hills. His parents were Zapotec. They were peasants. They died when he was 3. He worked the corn and herded sheep, and until he was 12 years old, he could not read, and he could not speak a word of Spanish. Only Zapotec, the language of his mountain. Remember him, a barefoot orphan on a hillside with no language the men in the capital would even recognize. We will find out what becomes of him. Keep moving east, off the highlands, down to where the land flattens and the rock turns to limestone, and you reach a peninsula that hides its water underground.
The Yucatan has almost no rivers.
Rain falls and vanishes straight through the porous stone, collecting in vast, flooded caves beneath the surface, and where the roof of a cave collapses, the water is revealed. A cenote, a round well of impossibly clear water, sometimes open to the sky, sometimes a hidden pool in a dark chamber hung with roots. There are thousands of them. To the Maya, they were sacred, doorways to the underworld, and the only reliable water in a dry land. And there is a secret, written in the way they are arranged. Across the northern Yucatan, a great many of the cenotes fall along a single, enormous arc, a ring nearly 200 kilometers wide, curving across the landscape. For a long time, no one knew why. We know now. That ring traces the buried rim of a crater. 66 million years ago, an asteroid the size of a city struck this exact spot, gouged a hole in the planet, and threw up enough debris to darken the sky and end the age of the dinosaurs. The impact shattered the bedrock in a perfect circle, and where the rock is most broken, the water pools and the cenotes form. The Maya built their sacred wells and their cities along the scar of the day the world nearly ended, without ever knowing it was there. And what cities they built. Step into the 9th century. The plaza is crowded. Long before the Aztecs, before the silver, the Maya are tracking the movement of Venus across the sky and writing it down. They are using a true script, the only fully developed writing system in the ancient Americas, carving their kings and their wars and their dates into stone. They have, independently, invented the concept of zero, a thing most of the world's mathematicians never managed. They calculate the length of the solar year more precisely than the calendar Europe is using at the time, and they record dates reaching millions of years into the past and the future. At Chichen Itza, they raise a step pyramid so exactly aligned that twice a year at the equinox, the late sun throws a shadow down its staircase in the shape of a serpent, light and dark, sliding down the stone until they meet a carved snake's head at the base. And then, centuries before the Spanish ever arrived, many of the great southern cities were abandoned. Drought, war, the exhaustion of the land, the reasons are still argued. The jungle came back over the plazas. For a long time, the world told a simple story. The Maya vanished, a lost civilization. The Maya did not vanish. Today, there are several million speakers of Maya languages living in the same peninsula their ancestors mapped the stars from. The grandmother selling oranges in the market in Mérida may be speaking a language that was old when Chichen Itza was new. The city's emptied, the people never left. And along the peninsula's coast, in the shallow lagoons, tens of thousands of flamingos still gather to feed, turning whole stretches of water pink at dawn, a color the Maya would have watched in exactly the same place 1,000 years ago. South and west of all this, the land rises again, and the jungle thickens into something older and darker. The closest thing North America has to a rainforest that swallows whole. In Chiapas, along the border with Guatemala, the Lacandon jungle holds the last great stand of tropical forest in Mexico. Inside it sits a reserve called Montes Azules, the most biodiverse place in the country. Howler monkeys throw their voices across the canopy at dawn, a sound like wind in a tunnel, carrying for kilometers. And through the green, rarely seen, moves the animal that sits at the top of it all. The jaguar, the largest cat in the Americas and the third largest in the world. It is built for this forest, a body low and heavy, a bite strong enough to punch through the skull of its prey, which it does, rather than going for the throat the way other big cats do. It swims. It hunts caiman in the water. A single jaguar may range across 100 square kilometers of forest, and where the jaguar still hunts, the whole system beneath it stays in balance. The deer and the peccary kept moving, the forest kept whole. To the ancient peoples here, it was a god. To the forest, it is the keystone. Pull it out, and the arch comes down. There are not many left. The forest that holds them is being cut, for cattle, for cropland, for roads, and the jaguar's 100-kilometer range is being broken into islands too small to feed it. What survives, survives in the protected core. The arch is still standing. It is standing on fewer stones than it used to.
Now turn all the way around
To the opposite corner of the country, where the land thins into a long, dry finger pointing south. And the real wealth is not on the peninsula, but in the sea beside it. Baja California reaches 800 miles down the Pacific, and between it and the mainland lies a body of water so rich that one of the great ocean explorers of the last century called it the aquarium of the world. The Gulf of California. Cold, nutrient-heavy currents rise from the deep here and feed everything. Schools of fish that turn the water silver, dolphins in the hundreds, the largest animal that has ever lived. Blue whales come here, so do the gray whales, who swim 10,000 kilometers from the Arctic to give birth in 3 shallow lagoons on the Baja coast, the only place on Earth they do it, and where, for reasons no one fully understands, The mothers sometimes bring their newborn calves to the side of the small boats to be touched. Off the peninsula's tip, in the warm months, the largest fish in the sea gathers to feed. Whale sharks, longer than a bus, harmless, filtering the water with their mouths open, drifting through swimmers who come from across the world to float beside something that size and feels small. And in the northern end of this richest of seas, an animal is being erased. The vaquita is a porpoise, the smallest in the world, grey and shy, with dark rings around its eyes like a held breath. It lives in one place only, the shallow, murky water at the top of the Gulf, and nowhere else on the planet. It has never been hunted. No one wants the vaquita. It is dying for a different fish entirely, the totoaba, whose swim bladder sells for a fortune on the black market across the Pacific, and which is caught in walls of net that the vaquita cannot see and cannot escape. The nets are illegal. They are set anyway. 30 years ago, there were a few hundred vaquita. The last counts suggest fewer than 10 remain, possibly fewer. It is the rarest marine mammal on Earth, and we are watching it go, in real time, for a thing it has nothing to do with. Hold that too. We will set it against something at the end. Before we leave the coast, one more thing the brochure never mentions. On the steamy lowlands of the Gulf side, around Veracruz, where Cortés first set foot on the mainland, grows an orchid that the rest of the world has been chasing ever since. Vanilla. The Totonac people cultivated it here for centuries, and for a long time, Mexico had a near monopoly on it for a reason that sounds almost like a riddle. The vanilla orchid is pollinated in the wild by one specific local bee, found only in this region, and nowhere else would the flowers set fruit. When Europeans tried to grow the vines elsewhere, the plants flowered beautifully and produced nothing at all. The world only broke the monopoly when, far away, someone worked out how to pollinate each flower by hand. A task that must still be done, one bloom at a time, on the single morning each blossom opens. The flavor in half the desserts on Earth traces back to an orchid, a vanished bee, and the people of one humid corner of the Mexican coast. But every Mexico we have found so far has been a Mexico under pressure. Conquered, mined, cut, drowning, vanishing. The country's deepest story is not loss. It is the opposite. It is the things that got away. North again, into the high deserts of Chihuahua, where the Sierra Madre splits the land with a system of gorges so vast that the Grand Canyon would fit inside it with room to spare. They call it the Copper Canyon. 6 canyons, deeper than anything in the United States, dropping more than 1.5 kilometers from rim to river. The walls staining green-blue with oxidized rock. And along the lips and ledges of those gorges live a people who came here to disappear. When Cortés and the Spanish swept through central Mexico, not everyone stayed to be conquered. A people who call themselves the Ruramuri. The word means roughly the light-footed ones, those who run, pulled back. Out of the heartland, up into the most broken, least reachable country they could find, into the canyons. And there, cut off, on terrain where a horse is useless and a road is impossible, they built a way of life around the one thing the land would still allow. They run, not as sport, as transport, as communication, as survival. A Ruramuri might cover 120 kilometers in a day across canyon country that would put a trained hiker on the ground, in sandals cut from old tire rubber, laced to the foot with a strip of leather. For most of their history, they hunted this way, not with bows, not with speed, but with endurance. They would simply follow a deer, walk it, jog it, never let it rest, for hours, across a heat the animal's body could not shed, until its legs gave out and it could not stand. Persistence hunting. They ran their food to death. Even their festivals are races. The Rarajipari is a kind of running game in which teams kick a small wooden ball ahead of them and chase it for distances that can pass 100 kilometers through the night by torchlight, the whole village following along the canyon trails. They fuel it on pinole, ground roasted corn stirred into water, and on chia. No carbon shoes, no gels. Ground corn, a wooden ball, and legs that have been climbing in and out of the deepest gorges in North America since childhood. For 300 years, the outside world barely knew they were there. And then, in 1993, the world found out. 1993, the starting line of an ultramarathon in Leadville, Colorado, 100 miles high in the Rocky Mountains over a course that breaks elite athletes. A small group of Ruramuri men line up among the lean, sponsored runners in their cushioned shoes and their carbon poles. The Ruramuri are wearing sandals. One of them is in his 50s. The starting gun fires, and the field pulls away from them, because the Ruramuri do not understand the idea of starting fast. And then, hour by hour, as the distance does its work and the others fade, the men in the tire sandals come through the field from the back. A 55-year-old named Victoriano Churro wins the race. His countrymen take second and fifth. They had not trained. They had simply lived their lives, and their lives were harder than the race. And it did not stop in the 90s. A few years ago, a team of Ruramuri women ran a relay across more than 500 kilometers of American desert, from Los Angeles toward Las Vegas, in their long, pleated skirts and their tire sandals, and finished. One woman from the canyons, Lorena Ramirez, has won ultramarathons outright, 50, 80, 100 kilometers, running in a skirt, in sandals, with no coach and no sponsor and no special diet, against the best-equipped endurance athletes in the world. The people who fled an empire by running never stopped running. And 5 centuries later, the running is still winning. That is the pattern once you start to see it. Not survival as something fragile and sad. Survival as the main event. You see it in the land itself, which refuses to settle. Mexico sits on the ring of fire, the seam where the great plates of the earth grind against each other, and the country is stitched with volcanoes, more than a few of them awake. Just southeast of the capital, a mountain the Aztecs called Popocatépetl, the Smoking Mountain, rises 5,500 meters and does exactly what its name says. It steams, it rumbles. Every so often it throws ash high enough to close the airports of a city of 20 million people, and then it settles again, and the towns on its flanks go back to their mornings in the shadow of a peak that could end them. People have lived beside it, knowingly, for thousands of years. The volcano is not a threat to be escaped. It is a neighbor. And the deserts, which look from the road like nothing, are full of things that have learned to persist in ways that border on the impossible. In the dark of the limestone caves, there is a fish, the Mexican tetra, that swims in pools no light has ever reached. Its relatives in the surface rivers have eyes and silver bodies. But the cave fish, over uncounted generations in total blackness, gave up its eyes entirely, lost them, grew skin over the sockets, because an eye is expensive to build and useless in the dark, and rerouted everything into other senses. A lateral line so fine it can map a whole chamber by the pressure of the water moving around it. it does not miss the light. It was never going to see it. It became something better suited to the only world it had. Not everything that persists does so on its own. In these same northern deserts once ranged the Mexican gray wolf, the smallest and rarest wolf in North America, the lobo of the borderlands. A century of trapping and poisoning carried out on both sides of the border to protect cattle drove it to the very edge. By the late 20th century, the wild population was zero. The animal survived only because a handful, by some accounts as few as 7 individuals, had been pulled into captivity before the last of the wild ones were killed. From those few, biologists began to rebuild a species. They bred them, raised pups that never saw a human face, and began, carefully, to release them back into the mountains of the Sierra Madre and the desert ranges to the north. It is slow, and it is fragile, and it is far from won. But there are wild wolves in those mountains again, born free, descended from the 7 that were all that stood between the lobo and nothing. A species reduced to a number you could count on 2 hands, walking its old country once more. Which brings us back, at last, to the thing that crosses the border every autumn, the thing no one could find. In the forests of central Mexico, on a handful of mountaintops in the state of Michoacán, there grows a particular tree, the oyamel fir, a high-altitude evergreen that survives only in a narrow band, cool but never freezing, damp but sheltered from the wind. It is a fussy, fragile tree, and it grows in only a few places on Earth, all of them in these mountains. And every winter, those firs perform something that, the first time you hear it, sounds like an exaggeration. They turn orange. Not the leaves, the firs are green. The orange is alive. It is butterflies. Monarch butterflies by the tens of millions, by some estimates approaching 1 billion in a good year, hanging in clusters so dense that the branches bow under their weight, coating every needle of every tree until the forest itself seems to breathe. When the morning sun crests the ridge and warms them, they lift off all at once, and the air fills with so many wings that you can hear them, a soft, dry rustle like rain that never lands, and the light coming through the forest turns the color of fire. Here is what makes it almost impossible to believe. The butterflies hanging in those trees have never been there before. A monarch lives only a few weeks. The ones that fly south in the autumn, from Canada, from the northern United States, 3,000 miles and more, are 4 or 5 generations removed from the ones that flew south the year before. No individual makes the round trip. The butterfly clinging to that fir was born in a field in Ontario or Michigan, and it has flown to a forest in Mexico that its great-great-grandparents left, and it has found the exact same grove of trees. Not the same region, the same trees. How a creature with a brain smaller than a pinhead navigates a continent to a place it has never been, reading the angle of the sun and, we think, the magnetic field of the planet itself, is one of the open questions of biology. And for the longest time, the deepest part of the mystery was simpler and stranger than that. No one knew where they went. Generations of North Americans watched the monarchs pour south every fall and disappear, and no scientist could say into what. The wintering ground of the entire eastern population of the monarch butterfly, hundreds of millions of animals, was, as late as the 1970s, completely unknown to the outside world. January 1975. A man named Ken Brugger and a woman named Catalina Aguado are walking the mountains of Michoacán, following a hunch, working for a Canadian scientist named Fred Urquhart, who has spent 4 decades tagging monarchs and tracing them south, losing the trail every time at the Mexican border. The local people, of course, have always known. The butterflies have come to these mountains every winter for as long as anyone can remember. But on that day in January, Brugger and Aguado climb high into the Oyamel firs and find the colony. The trees solid orange, the ground deep in wings, the air shaking, and the secret that had held for the entire history of science breaks open in an afternoon. When Urquhart himself finally stands in that forest a year later, an old man at the end of a 40-year search, a tagged butterfly falls at his feet. One he had not placed. One a stranger had tagged, far to the north, and released into the air, trusting it would find its way to a place no one could name. It had. But 1 billion butterflies in 14 small groves of a single fussy tree is not strength. It is the opposite. It is everything balanced on a needle. There is no second forest. If the Oyamel firs go, to logging, to a warming climate that pushes their narrow band of survivable cold higher up the mountain than the mountain reaches, there is nowhere else for the monarchs to go. The whole migration, one of the largest movements of life on the planet, depends on a few hundred hectares of trees that take 80 years to grow. And so the people who live in those mountains have done something stubborn and specific. In a single stretch of months in 2025, communities across the reserve planted 100,000 young Oyamel firs. Not where the firs grow now, but higher up the slopes, ahead of the warming, building a forest the butterflies will need in 50 years. For butterflies, none of these planters will live to see arrive. You cannot rush a fir. You can only plant it and trust the way Urquhart trusted his tagged butterfly, that something you set in motion will be found in a place you will never stand, by a generation that is not yours. That trust is the thing the 2 postcards leave out. Think back to the boy on the hillside in Oaxaca, the Zapotec orphan who could not speak Spanish. He walked down out of his mountains to the city, taught himself the colonizer's language, taught himself the law. His name was Benito Juárez, and in a country run for 300 years by and for people who looked nothing like him, he rose, judge, governor, and then, against everything the arithmetic of his birth should have allowed, president of Mexico. The only fully indigenous president the country has ever had. And then, in 1862, France invaded. The European powers decided Mexico would be easier run by a European and installed an Austrian archduke on a throne in Mexico City, calling him emperor, propped up by French troops. Juarez did not surrender the republic. He loaded the government into a black carriage and ran it from the road, moving from town to town across the northern desert, one step ahead of the army, the legitimate government of Mexico, reduced to a man, a carriage, and the refusal to stop. It took 5 years. The French left, the empire collapsed. And in 1867, the republic Juarez had carried in a carriage across the desert was restored by the orphan who had started with no shoes and no Spanish and no reason in the world to believe he would be anything at all. A barefoot boy becomes the head of a nation. A drowned lake will not stay drowned. A people flee an empire and turn their flight into the fastest legs on the continent. A wolf comes back from 7. A fish gives up its eyes and thrives. A butterfly finds a forest it has never seen. None of this is the Mexico of the wristband or the headline. All of it is true at the same time, in the same country, right now. And in those last canals on the edge of the capital, the final scraps of the Mexico's floating city, the only place the old water still runs, the creature I promised you is still there. The axolotl, a salamander that simply refuses to grow up. Other salamanders are born in the water, then crawl out and change, lose their gills, leave the lake. The axolotl never does. It keeps its feathered gills, its wide, pale face, its permanent half-smile, and lives its whole life in the water it was born in the canals of Xochimilco, and nowhere else on the planet. And it can do something that has made it one of the most studied animals on Earth. It heals without scarring. Cut its leg, it grows a new one. Bones, nerves, everything, perfectly. Damage its heart, its spine, even parts of its brain, and it rebuilds them. We are still trying to understand how. In the wild, it is nearly gone. The canals polluted, the city pressing in. And yet, there it is, in the last clean water of a drained lake, an animal that cannot stop regrowing the parts of itself the world keeps taking. It is hard to think of a better emblem for the country it lives in. Not everything will make it. The vaquita may already be past saving. Fewer than 10 small grey porpoises in a single corner of a single sea, dying for someone else's fish. Some of the 68 languages will fall silent in the next few decades. Some already have. The forest that holds the jaguar is smaller every year. This is the honest part, and the country does not need it sweetened. Persistence is not a guarantee. It is a fight, and some of the fighters lose. But the monarchs came back this spring, as they always have, to firs that strangers climbed into the mountains to plant. Nahuatl, the language of the people the Spanish tried to erase, is still spoken by more than 1.5 million people today, and words it gave the world, chocolate, tomato, avocado, are in your kitchen right now. The Day of the Dead still sets its table every November. The runners still run. The wolves are back in the Sierra. The axolotl still heals. The city still sinks toward the lake, and the lake still waits. And life in this country goes on being far larger and far older and far more stubborn than anyone watching the coastline or the news would ever guess. We come to a place like Mexico thinking we already know it. The beach, the border, the 2 flat pictures we were handed before we ever arrived. And the deepest thing a journey like this can teach is how little those pictures were ever going to hold. That knowing the name of a country, even loving the small part of it you have seen, is not the same as knowing the country at all. You only ever know half of it. The other half is still out there, in the canyons, in the cloud forest, in the orange light coming through the firs, waiting the way it has waited all along, for anyone willing to look past the postcard. Thank you for traveling with us. Until the next journey.